Before you listen to this story, let me tell you this. Not every broken home has loud fights. Some homes break in silence. Some girls disappear in plain sight. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how silence became my survival, and later, my strength. If you're watching this, please take a second to subscribe to this channel. These stories aren't just mine. They might be yours too, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there is waiting to feel seen. I wasn't the loud one, the troublemaker, the rebel. I was the quiet one, the one who sat in the corner at family dinners, who answered questions with a nod, who never caused waves, who kept her door closed and her voice slower than her heartbeat. I grew up in a house full of noise, not joyful noise, but chaos disguised as normal. My older brother shouted, my younger sister cried, and my parents fought in sharp, cold tones that filled the walls like poison. But me, I stayed out of the way. I learned early that silence kept me safe. I learned how to walk without making the floorboards creak. I learned how to read facial expressions like weather forecasts, always predicting the next storm. No one ever asked how I was doing. They assumed I was fine because I didn't complain. I got good grades, kept my room clean, stayed invisible. But the truth is, I was slowly disappearing. I used to lie in bed at night, watching the light flicker under my door, wondering if anyone in the world would notice if I stopped trying. I started writing in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. Not poetry, not stories, just pieces of myself, questions, fears, dreams I couldn't say out loud. I wrote every night like it was the only thing keeping me alive. One day, during a particularly bad argument between my parents, screaming downstairs, glass breaking, the dog barking in fear, I climbed out my window and sat on the roof. It was cold. My legs were shaking. But for some reason, the air up there felt safer than the air inside. I stared at the stars and whispered, please, just one person, see me. The next morning, my English teacher noticed the bags under my eyes. She kept me after class and said, Sarah, are you okay? I almost lied. I almost smiled. But something cracked inside me. I said, no, just one word. And she didn't rush me. She didn't fix it. She just listened. That moment changed everything. Because someone finally saw the quiet one. She encouraged me to submit something to the school writing contest. I said no. She smiled and said, it's already in you. Let them hear it. I submitted one of the entries from my hidden notebook. I didn't expect anything. But a week later, I was called to the principal's office. I thought I was in trouble. But when I walked in, they handed me a certificate. I had won first place. My piece, The Girl Who Never Spoke, was going to be published in the local paper. That afternoon, my father saw the article and looked at me like he was meeting me for the first time. Did you write this? He asked. I nodded. He didn't say much, just HMPH, and walked away. But that night, he knocked on my door. He didn't say sorry. He didn't say he was proud, but he said, your words, they hit hard, and that was enough. For now, I kept writing. I stopped hiding. I started speaking. Not all at once, not loudly, but clearly my mother noticed. My siblings did too, and slowly, the family I had grown up in, the one that only knew how to shout or stay silent, started learning how to listen. Because when the quiet one speaks, it shakes everything. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had a voice, and it had been waiting my whole life to be heard. After my story was published in the local paper, everything changed, and not all in the way I expected. At school, teachers I barely spoke to began treating me differently. Some smiled at me like they were proud. A few students I'd never even had a conversation with came up and said, hey, I read your story. It was deep. Or that was brave of you. Brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt exposed. Like the skin I'd been hiding under had been peeled back for everyone to see. It was the first time my pain had been on display. And while some people offered kindness, others offered something else, judgment. Rumors started spreading. Did you read what she wrote? It's about her parents. She made that stuff up for attention. No wonder she never talks. She's probably just dramatic. The whispers slithered through the hallways like smoke. I didn't expect applause, but I also didn't expect cruelty. The worst part was when the story reached family members. My aunt called my mother in the middle of dinner one night, shouting over the phone, "What's this article Sarah wrote? Why would you let her embarrass the family like that?" I sat frozen as my mother's face turned red, her eyes darting toward me, then away. She didn't defend me. She just kept saying, "It's a misunderstanding." She exaggerated. Later that night, she knocked on my door, not with anger, but with fear, Sarah. She said quietly, "Why did you have to include the part about us?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "Because it's true." Her silence said everything. I wasn't trying to shame anyone. I wasn't trying to ruin reputations. I was trying to survive. I was trying to finally say the things I had swallowed for years. But in speaking out, I stirred up old wounds no one in my family wanted to admit existed. My father didn't say anything for days. Then, one night, he came home late and tossed the newspaper on the table in front of me. "So this is how you get attention now." I wanted to yell. I wanted to scream. But instead, I stood up, walked to my room, and locked the door. Not out of fear this time, but to protect my peace. I kept writing. I didn't stop, even when the school counselor called me in to check on my emotional stability, even when my mother cried, saying, "You've painted us like monsters," even when my uncle texted me, "You've always been the weird one," because for every cruel word I received, I also got messages from strangers, girls who said, "I thought I was the only one," teachers who said, "You gave words to things I never knew how to say." I realized that when you finally use your voice, the people who benefited from your silence will always be the first to try and shut you up. But that didn't mean I should stop. It meant I had finally hit something real. One afternoon, I stayed behind after class and asked my English teacher, "Did I do something wrong?" She looked at me, really looked, and said, "No, you did something right. That's why it hurts." And I carried those words with me. At home, things grew colder, not louder, just tense. Like everyone was waiting for me to apologize. But I didn't. I had spent my whole life apologizing for existing. Now, I was learning to stand. I started publishing more entries on a free blog. I didn't use my full name, but my words were raw, real, and mine. My following grew slowly. And with every message from someone who felt seen, I felt a little less alone. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was still quiet, but I was no longer silent. And there's a difference. A quiet girl watches, listens, learns. A silent girl suffers. And I was done suffering in silence. I was ready to speak, even if it made the wrong people uncomfortable. Especially then. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because it rained that morning, and I forgot my umbrella, which meant I was soaked by the time I reached school. I was sitting in the library during lunch, my usual quiet spot by the window, when Miss Clark, my English teacher, walked over with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "Sarah," she said, "read this." I opened it. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a flyer, a writing workshop for young survivors. A national nonprofit, Voices Unmuted, was holding an event in our city. Teens from all over the region were invited to attend, and 5 would be chosen to share their story live on stage at a community event. "You should apply," she said gently. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't imagine myself on a stage, reading words that once only lived under my bed. "I'm not like those people," I said. "I'm not strong enough." She didn't argue. She just said, "You already are. You just don't know it yet." That night, I stared at the flyer for hours. I opened the application form 5 times, closed it 5 times, but around midnight, I filled it out. I attached one of my blog entries, added a short note about why writing saved me, and hit submit. I didn't tell anyone. not even my friends, not even Miss Clark, because part of me still didn't believe it was real. 2 weeks passed. I forgot about it. Then one afternoon, I opened my inbox and froze. The subject line read, "Congratulations, you've been selected." I blinked, reread it, and my hands went numb. They wanted me to come to the workshop. All expenses paid, 3 days of mentoring, connection, healing, and if I chose, I could read my story on the final night. I sat there in silence, heart pounding, not from fear, but from disbelief. That night at dinner, I told my parents. My mom blinked at me, unsure of what to say. My dad sighed and said, "You're still doing that writing stuff." I nodded. They invited me to speak. He didn't respond. I took the silence as a yes. The workshop was unlike anything I'd ever known. I met people like me, not loud, not attention-seeking, just survivors. Some had stories darker than mine. Others had lighter ones, but we all shared something unspoken, a kind of understanding that came without explanation. We spent hours writing, crying, laughing, even sitting in total silence that somehow felt comforting. On the second night, we were asked if we wanted to volunteer to read our pieces aloud at the final event. I raised my hand before I could talk myself out of it. I don't know why. Maybe because I was tired of running from my voice. Maybe because, for the first time, it felt like someone might actually want to hear what I had to say. When my name was called on stage that night, I thought my legs would collapse. The auditorium wasn't huge, but it felt massive. My heart thudded against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I stood behind the podium, gripped the paper, looked at the audience, and saw one face I didn't expect. Miss Clark. She had come. She was in the second row, hands clasped, eyes locked on mine, like I was the only one in the room. I took a shaky breath, and I began to read. I told them about being the quiet one, about writing in secret, about the silence at home that was louder than any scream. I told them about the pain I carried in my chest like a second heartbeat. I told them about the moment I realized my silence wasn't protection, it was prison, and that now I was learning to break out. I don't remember if I cried. I think I did. I just remember the sound of stillness, the kind that only comes when people are listening. When I finished, the room erupted in applause, not the kind of applause people give out of politeness, the kind that feels like a wave crashing over you, real, raw, overwhelming. Afterward, people came up to me, strangers, teachers, teens. One girl hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for saying what I never could." I didn't have words, just tears, happy ones, grateful ones. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling in my hotel room and whispered, "You did it." And for the first time in my life, I wasn't proud of surviving in silence. I was proud of breaking it. I came back from the workshop different. It's hard to explain how a few days can change you. But when you've spent years locked inside yourself, even one moment of freedom is enough to rearrange your entire soul. I walked differently, not with confidence, not yet, but with purpose. I had spoken, and the world hadn't shattered. I had cried in public, and I hadn't crumbled. I came back to school and things felt bigger, or maybe I had finally grown into them. Miss Clark hugged me the day I returned and said, "I knew you'd shine." And she meant it. I started writing more on my blog, not just entries about my past, but reflections, poems, letters to my younger self. I didn't post for likes or followers. I posted because writing still felt like breathing. And now I knew other people were breathing through my words too. The blog slowly gained attention. People shared it. A few teachers followed it. Then, one day, I received an email I never expected. A well-known online platform that featured youth voices wanted to republish one of my posts. They called it hauntingly honest. I stared at the screen, stunned. Me, on a national site. I read the message over and over before replying yes. They asked for a photo. I sent one. They asked for a short author bio. I wrote, Sarah B., 17, writer, survivor, truth teller. The article went live a week later. I didn't promote it. I didn't even post the link. But somehow, it found its way back home. And to the people who once tried to keep me quiet. I was walking through the hallway at school when my cousin messaged me. "You really posted that?" On the internet, then came a flood of texts. Some shocked, some mocking, some angry. I sat frozen on a bench during lunch, watching the reactions roll in. And then, the one that sent my stomach spiraling. A message from my mother. "We need to talk, now." I didn't respond. I went straight home after school, my heart pounding. She was waiting in the living room, holding her phone. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she said. "Our name is out there. Your words are out there. People are asking questions." I stayed silent, not because I was scared, but because I was listening. She went on. "You made us sound like monsters, like we never cared, like we never tried." And maybe she was right, in her eyes. But I wasn't writing her truth. I was writing mine. I said softly, "I never said you didn't love me. I just wrote what it felt like growing up in this house. I wrote what silence did to me." Her eyes welled up with tears. Not rage this time, maybe regret. "You could have come to me," she whispered. "I did," I said. 100 times, you just didn't hear me." The room went quiet. My father came in, read the tension, and didn't speak, just looked at me with that unreadable stare. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and said, "I'm not sorry for telling my story. I'm sorry it hurts. But it's real." I left the house and went to the park. My notebook in hand, I sat under the same tree where I used to dream of running away. And I wrote. I wrote about guilt. About speaking truth in a world that punishes you for it. I wrote about the courage it takes to disappoint people in order to save yourself. That night, I posted it, title, "When Your Healing Offends the People Who Hurt You." It went viral. Thousands of shares, hundreds of comments, strangers saying, "This is me, this is my life." You put into words what I never could. For every family member who called me dramatic, 10 strangers thanked me for surviving. That's when I realized something. My family didn't have to understand my healing. It wasn't for them. My story didn't need their permission. My truth didn't need their applause. I wasn't writing to be accepted. I was writing to be free. And I was. It had only been a few days since my blog post went viral. But it felt like my entire life had shifted. Teachers began treating me with a kind of quiet respect. Students I never knew started nodding at me in the halls like I was someone worth noticing, and the inbox on my blog was filling up faster than I could read the messages. There were messages from girls in foster care, boys who'd grown up without love, women who had been mothers too young, and even teachers who admitted they never realized what some of their students were going through. The words were always the same. "Thank you. I thought I was alone." And then, one message changed everything. It was from a woman named Riley Thomas, host of a podcast called Unmuted Voices, a global storytelling show that featured survivors, writers, and people who had broken silence. I had listened to that podcast before. I had cried during episodes. I had written quotes from it in my journal. And now, here was Riley in my inbox saying, "Sarah, I read your blog. I wept. I don't usually reach out directly like this, but your voice, it matters. Would you be open to coming on the show? We'll record remotely. Your story could help thousands." I read the message 3 times. My hands trembled. I closed the email, opened it again, showed it to Ms. Clark there. Next day, she gasped, smiled, and said, "Do it." I wanted to, badly. But I was scared, not just of the microphone or the attention, but of my family hearing even more. What if my voice reached someone I didn't want it to reach? What if I said, too much, but something stronger than fear whispered, "You've come too far to turn back now"? So I replied, "Yes, I'm in." The day of the recording, Riley's team sent me a link and told me to find a quiet room. I sat in my closet, surrounded by clothes, headphones on, laptop open, heart pounding. Then I heard her voice, calm, warm, welcoming. Sarah, I just want to start by saying thank you. Take your time. We're here to hold space for you. And so I began. I told my story again. But this time, not just for myself. I spoke for every quiet girl still hiding her tears, for every teen writing their truth in secret, for every survivor trying to heal while being blamed. I spoke slowly. I cried once. I laughed once. Riley asked questions gently, never pushing too hard, always letting silence be okay. And at the end, she said, "You are the kind of voice this world needs more of. Thank you for sharing your pain, your power, and your poetry." The episode aired 2 weeks later, and everything exploded. My blog tripled in followers. Emails came from across the world: Canada, Nigeria, India, Brazil, the UK. People said things like, "You said what I never could. Your voice made me call my therapist again. You gave me courage to write my own story." I cried, not from sadness, from release, from the feeling of being seen, really seen, by strangers across oceans. But with the visibility came backlash too. One of my uncles posted something passive-aggressive on Facebook about kids these days airing dirty laundry online. My father didn't say anything, just looked at me differently at dinner, like I was a stranger. But my mother surprised me. One night, she walked into my room, sat at the edge of my bed, and whispered, "I listened to your podcast." My stomach dropped. I waited for the argument. But instead, she said, "It hurt." But it was true. I looked at her, tears rising. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," I whispered. She nodded. "I know you were trying to heal. I just wished I'd heard you sooner." We cried together. Not everything was fixed, but something opened, a door that had been bolted shut for years. And I knew this was only the beginning. My voice had traveled the world, but more importantly, it had finally reached home. It had been 2 months since the podcast aired, and I still hadn't gotten used to strangers knowing my story, or the way it seemed to travel ahead of me into rooms I hadn't even entered yet. Emails continued to pour in. My blog was now followed by thousands, but more than that, I felt something inside me shifting. I walked taller, spoke fuller, and smiled without flinching. Then one afternoon, I received an email from the head of a local youth organization. They were hosting a community event for Teen Mental Health Week, and they wanted me to speak on stage in front of a live audience. I stared at the screen, rereading the line, "We believe your story could be life-changing for others." I sat frozen, fear and pride doing battle in my chest. I'd spoken on a podcast, yes. But this was different. A stage meant eyes, reactions. It meant I couldn't hide behind a keyboard. But the more I thought about it, the more a quiet voice inside said, "You're ready." So I said yes. They asked for a title. I chose "The Power of Breaking Your Own Silence." The week before the event, I barely slept. I rehearsed in my room, in the mirror, whispering the words that had once been locked inside me. The night before, I almost backed out, but I remembered every message I'd ever received, the ones that said, "You helped me speak," and I knew I couldn't run now. The venue was a small community auditorium. Nothing fancy, but it felt massive. To me, my name was printed on a little sign backstage. There were rows of folding chairs, a simple stage, a single microphone. I peeked out from the side curtain, scanning the crowd. And then I saw him, my brother, sitting in the front row. I hadn't seen him in almost a year. We had grown up in the same house, but drifted into opposite lives. He was older, louder, angrier. He had mocked my quiet, called me soft, told me to grow a spine. He had slammed doors and cursed and made the walls shake. And now he was here. I felt the air leave my lungs. Panic rose. My hand shook. 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind. Did he come to laugh? To confront me? Did someone invite him? But there he was, still, quiet, staring at the stage. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I had walked too far, climbed too high. So I stepped up. I grabbed the microphone, and I began. My voice cracked at first, But I didn't stop. I spoke. The words I had written late at night under bed sheets. The words I had typed through tears. The words I had once been too afraid to whisper. I talked about growing up unseen, about learning to survive silence, about discovering that truth could be both terrifying and freeing. I didn't mention him by name, but he was in the story. In every memory, I didn't look at him until the very end, when I said my final words. Your story is yours to tell, even if no one claps. Even if no one believes you, you tell it anyway, because you deserve to be free. I looked straight at him, and he was crying. My brother, the one I thought was made of steel, had tears on his face. After the event, people came up to me. They hugged me, shook my hand, told me I had changed them. But I kept glancing at the door, wondering if he'd already left. Then I saw him, standing awkwardly near the back, hands in his jacket pockets. I walked up, heart racing. Hey, I said. He looked at me, eyes red. You really said all that? I nodded. Yeah, I lived it. He took a breath. I didn't know. I guess I did. I just never wanted to deal with it. Silence. Then, you were braver than all of us, even back then. He looked down, kicked the floor, then whispered, I'm sorry. 2 words, but they hit like thunder. I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't. But I nodded, and somehow, that was enough for that night. He left. I stayed. I sat in the quiet of the now empty auditorium, stared at the stage, and whispered to myself, I'm not the quiet one anymore. I'm the strong one. I thought the auditorium event would be the peak, the moment I'd look back on years later and say, that's when it all changed. But life, it turns out, had more turning points planned. A week after the speech, an email arrived with the subject, publishing opportunity. From one survivor to another, I clicked it, half suspicious. It was from a woman named Amelia Grant, an editor at a well-known publishing house that focused on personal memoirs, especially stories from young voices that were usually overlooked. She had seen the viral blog post, then the podcast, and finally, a video clip someone had uploaded of my speech. Her words were simple, honest, and powerful. Sarah, I don't want to exploit your pain. I want to amplify your strength. Would you consider writing a memoir? The world needs your story. All of it. My hand shook as I read it. A book. Me, the girl who used to whisper apologies to herself at night, who once believed silence was the only way to survive, now being offered a chance to publish her entire life. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. That night, I sat in the corner of my room, staring at the old journal I used to hide under my bed. The pages were still tear-stained, the corners still bent. I opened it and read the first line I ever wrote. I'm writing this so I don't disappear. I cried. But this time, not from pain, from realization. I hadn't disappeared. I had become louder than I ever imagined. I finally replied to Amelia, yes, but I need time. She understood. The next few weeks were a blur. We had Zoom meetings. She sent me sample contracts. We talked about deadlines, tone, titles, and the weight of telling your full truth in print. But the closer I got to signing, the more afraid I became. Because a blog can be deleted, a podcast fades, a speech is a moment, but a book lives forever. And I knew if I told everything, really everything, it would mean putting names to faces, pain to people, memories to moments my family still denied. I sat with it for days. I spoke to Ms. Clark, who said, it's your story, Sarah, and no one has the right to rewrite it but you. I spoke to my therapist, who said, you don't owe anyone silence. But still, I hesitated, until one morning, I found a letter slipped into my locker, no name, just handwriting that looked familiar. It read, I used to laugh at you, call you weak, but the truth is, you were always the strongest. Your voice saved me. And you don't even know who I am. Please keep telling your story for people like me. That was the moment. That was the final push. I signed the contract. I wrote the first chapter that night. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished, but it was honest. I called the book The Quietest Girl in the Room. The process took months. I cried a lot. Some chapters reopened wounds I thought had scarred over. Others made me laugh at small moments of peace I had forgotten. I included my mother's silent apologies, my brother's front row tears, my own trembling hands, and every word I wrote for the girl I used to be, the one who thought no one would ever hear her. I sent the manuscript in just before my 18th birthday. Amelia called me that afternoon. She was crying. "This book," she said, "is going to change lives." I believed her. But more than that, I believed in myself. The quiet girl. The one who refused to stay invisible. The one who was finally, fully seen. The day my book was released, I didn't sleep. I watched the sunrise through my bedroom window, wrapped in the same blanket I used to hide under when I was 10 and afraid of footsteps in the hallway. I kept refreshing the online bookstore page, waiting to see it. The Quietest Girl in the Room by Sarah B. And when it appeared, with my name, my story, and my words, I stared at the screen, frozen. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even smiling. I just felt still, like the moment you reach the top of a mountain and realize you're still breathing. The messages started pouring in before noon. Old classmates, strangers from across the country, teachers, mothers, teenagers, survivors. They weren't just reading my story, they were seeing themselves in it. Page 70 broke me. One girl messaged, "Your chapter about silence felt like my childhood." Another said, "My blog was flooded. My Instagram DMs were overwhelming." But with the love came waves of discomfort too, not from strangers, but from the people who knew the real names behind the characters. My cousin posted on Facebook, "Some people write fiction and call it truth." One aunt texted me, "You should have come to us first." And then there was my father, the man who hadn't said a word about my book. I came home one afternoon and saw the copy sitting on the kitchen table, and opened and touched. I asked gently, "Did you read it?" He didn't look up from his phone, just said, "Don't need to." My heart cracked a little, not because I expected him to praise me, but because part of me still wanted him to understand. That night, my mom knocked on my door. She held her own copy, with a bookmark tucked near the back. Her eyes were glassy. Some of it was hard to read, she said. But I needed to. I didn't know what to say. She sat beside me on the bed and whispered, "I wish I had noticed more. Been better. Loved you louder." I cried. She cried. There were no apologies big enough to fix the past, but her presence, her honesty, it was enough for now. School was a whirlwind. Some teachers pulled me aside, whispering, "You were brave." Some students started avoiding eye contact, like my truth made them uncomfortable. But there were others. One girl left a sticky note on my locker that read, "I'm not ready to speak, but because of you, I believe I can someday." That single note meant more to me than any review. A week later, the local news reached out. They wanted to interview me. I said yes. The segment aired with soft music, my voiceover layered with old photos, and the anchor calling me a young voice for the voiceless. After it aired, a box showed up at my door, full of letters from teen readers. I read each one. Some smelled like perfume. Others were written in shaky handwriting. One just said, "You saved me." That was the moment I realized my pain had become someone else's permission to heal. But there were hard days too. Nights when I questioned if I shared too much. Moments I panicked about my future, my safety, my relationships. There were trolls online. Of course, people who called me attention-seeking or dramatic. But I no longer shrank at those words because I knew something deeper. I didn't write to be liked. I wrote to survive, and somehow, in doing so, I helped others do the same. I kept going, speaking at schools, joining youth panels, writing articles, and every time I stood on stage, I remembered that little girl, huddled in her room, whispering into her journal, and I wanted her to see what she became. Not just heard, not just healed, unstoppable, 3 months after the book release, I received the email that made my heart stop, not out of fear, but disbelief. The subject line read, International Youth Mental Health Summit. Invitation to speak in Geneva. I blinked, worried. My hands trembled. They wanted me, the girl who used to whisper instead of speak, to stand in front of world leaders, researchers, and advocates, and tell my story. I scrolled through the email, trying to process it. Full travel paid, 3 nights in Switzerland, a keynote panel, my name on a program next to doctors and psychologists and policymakers, and me, a girl whose only credential was survival. I forwarded the email to Ms. Clark. She called me within minutes. Sir, she said breathlessly, you have to go. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to scream it from the rooftops. But something heavy pulled at my chest. Fear, not stage fright. I could handle audiences now. But the idea of leaving home, of being that far away, alone, felt like too much. What if I panic on the plane? What if I froze in front of important people? What if I wasn't enough for 2 days? I didn't respond. I stared at the packed bag sitting in my room, untouched. My passport lay on top. My flight was booked. But still, something inside me whispered, you're still that scared little girl. You're just pretending to be brave. I didn't tell my parents until the day before departure. My dad didn't say much, just raised his eyebrows and muttered, hope you know what you're doing. But my mom, she hugged me, tighter than usual. Just remember, she said, your voice belongs to you first. Don't give it away unless it feels right. That stayed with me the morning of the flight. I stood at the airport gate, passport in hand, staring at the hallway leading to the plane. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone. The old panic returned, the kind I hadn't felt since my early blog days. The kind that made my chest tighten and my vision blur. I stepped aside, let people board. One by one, they passed me. The agent looked at me kindly and said, last call. And that's when I saw her, a little girl, maybe 10, sitting near the gate, holding a book, my book. She looked up, our eyes met. She whispered to her mom, who smiled and said, I think that's her. The girl stood up, walked over, shyly, and said, are you the quiet girl? I nodded, tears rising fast. She smiled. I read your story. I told my counselor, I'm not scared anymore. That was it. That was all I needed. I hugged her, whispered, I'm proud of you, and turned to the gate. I boarded, heart pounding. But I didn't look back. Geneva was beautiful, clean air, crisp skies, and people who made space for every voice, even mine. The day of the summit, I stood backstage, microphone in hand, listening to the host say, our next speaker is not a doctor. She's not a politician. She's a survivor. And sometimes, that's the most powerful kind of expert. When I stepped on stage, I saw rows of people, researchers, activists, survivors, but all I could think about was the girl at the gate. And so, I told my story again. Not perfectly, not without tears, but truthfully. I spoke about silence, about fear, about reclaiming power in small ways, through words, through writing, through not backing down even when your knees shake. When I finished, there was a pause, then a wave of applause that shook the room. Afterward, a woman from South Africa hugged me and said, you gave language to my pain. A boy from Lebanon said, your story is my story. And I realized my voice had crossed oceans, but more than that, my healing had. On the flight home, I stared out the window at the clouds and whispered, I almost didn't come, but I had, and that changed everything. Coming home from Geneva felt like landing on a different planet, not because the world had changed, but because I had. I'd left as a girl with a suitcase full of fear and returned as a woman carrying the weight of stories, mine and others. Opportunities flooded in. Publishers wanted a second book. A documentary team pitched a film based on my story. Schools requested me as a speaker. I even got an offer to co-host a podcast. It was overwhelming, exciting. But somewhere in the noise, I began to lose something I hadn't noticed slipping away. My peace. I found myself waking up at 3 a.m. to answer interview emails, saying yes to things I didn't fully understand, smiling in photos I wasn't sure I wanted taken. I felt like I was becoming a brand instead of a person. My story, once sacred, started to feel used. One morning, I stared at a packed calendar and realized I hadn't journaled in weeks. I hadn't written for myself in almost a month. Everything I said was curated, public, polished. I wasn't healing anymore. I was performing recovery. That's when the offer came. A national TV show, one of the biggest, wanted me on for a primetime interview, full segment, live. Millions would watch. Everyone told me to say yes. Ms. Clark, my publisher, even my mom, they said, "This is your moment." But when I closed the email and sat in the quiet of my room, something inside me whispered, "But at what cost?" I was tired, not just from travel or speaking, but from always being the girl who had to be brave, who had to inspire, who had to turn trauma into something beautiful. And I wondered, what if I didn't? What if I chose peace over platform, healing over headlines? I took a walk. No phone, no music, just me. And I remembered that first blog post, the one that started it all. I had written it for me, not the world. I cried on that walk, not from sadness, but from the weight of permission. I went home and wrote a post called "The Quiet Girl is Resting." I didn't delete my past. I didn't cancel events. I just stepped back. I said no to the TV interview. I paused the podcast. I told my publisher I needed time. The world didn't collapse. In fact, something beautiful happened. People reached out, saying, "Thank you for modeling rest. Thank you for not burning out for applause." And slowly, quietly, I found my peace again. I returned to journaling. I painted. I read poetry on my porch. I learned that healing isn't just about telling your story. Sometimes it's about living quietly without having to explain it. Months passed. Then, one day, I sat down and wrote a poem, raw, soft, full of breath. It wasn't for anyone. It was just mine. And that's when I knew I hadn't left my platform. I had just reclaimed it, on my terms, my timeline, my truth. Because being the quiet one doesn't mean being invisible. It means knowing when to speak and when to listen to yourself. And I was finally listening.